My name is Ryan Brassfield, and I am going to be presenting on the expensive tissue hypothesis. So, kind of an introduction. First of all, what is the expensive tissue hypothesis? And this is a pretty straightforward hypothesis saying that the development and evolution of an enlarged human brain came at the expense of the gut size. So there's a negative correlation between brain size and gut size. While this is a very narrow hypothesis, it's beneficial to look at the energy trade-off hypothesis as well, which was created shortly after the expensive tissue hypothesis in order to make a broader scope. And this hypothesis is looking at the trade-off of one organ for another. So it's similar to the expensive tissue hypothesis without being as specific. And so this is beneficial because it can allow for more comparative studies to understand this idea of trade-offs and to be able to support the expensive tissue hypothesis in that way. Some topics that we'll be looking at to support the expensive tissue hypothesis are looking at energetics, improved diet, which relates to energetics, as well as comparative anatomy studies. So before we get into it, this kind of gives a nice chart of how a larger brain could be paid for in multiple ways. So first we see the first division, and it's to an increased energy turnover, which just means you expend a lot of energy, but you take a lot of energy in. So it's a constant cycle of energy. The more extensive branch is change of allocation. This can be done first through decreased maintenance, and a branch of that we see the decreased gut size, which is the expensive tissue hypothesis, or decrease in muscle. Or we can see it through decreased production, which we can see decreased growth, or decreased energy towards reproduction. That could be done through a decreased litter size and increased birth interval. While all of these are important and can play a role for a larger brain, the point of this is to show the importance of mainly the change of gut size. And so the next slide here gives a little background of how much energy the brain uses and other organs. So we see that the brain uses 20 to 30% of energy that is brought in from the into the body. This jumps all the way to 70% in infants. This just shows how expensive the brain is and how important it is to get energy there. Part of this is, if we think about it, if you're laying in bed, not all of your muscles are working. During sympathetic activity, gut activity is decreased. But the brain, sleeping, awake, thinking, watching TV, it's constantly active and working. This little comparison right here of comparing to brain tissue to muscle tissue. A piece of brain tissue uses 22 times the energy of a similar piece of muscle tissue. So it's pretty expensive. And then the chart, we can see the size of the organs compared to how much energy they use. And we see the brain, heart, kidney, liver, and GI tract account for a very small percent of the body mass, and yet they use up to around 68% of the total BMR, body BMR. So they're important tissues to look at, and gut is one of those. And so if we can decrease the energy there, it's helpful. Here, the picture on the bottom right, we can see a comparison of the human brain and chimp brain, and the significant difference in those sizes. The human brain is substantially larger than the chimp brain. So knowing how much energy the human brain brain tissue in general uses, we can see that the human brain and the human body is going to be allocating a lot more energy to that than, let's say, a chimp. On the left, by looking at primates, especially since they're the closest relatives to humans, they kind of use primates and looking at their size and looking at their organs to create this chart of what would be expected for the main organs, most expensive organs of the human body. So we see a smaller brain, larger gut size, good sized liver, smaller kidney, smaller heart, but still good size, more similar to the brain. But what's really observed, the liver, kidney, and heart are similar to what would be expected. But as we can see, the brain is much larger and the gut is much smaller, showing that our gut has taken a decrease in size for a larger brain. One way that this is possible is through a richer, more efficient diet. And so this is important because if we think about things like certain carbs, like starches and more difficult plants to digest, there's nutrients in those, but it takes a more extensive gut and much more time and energy to break those down to extract those nutrients. What we saw with early hominids was probably a move towards a more shore-based diet. This is important because a shore-based diet is accessible, and it's also high in iodine and iron, which are key minerals for the brain, as well as zinc, copper, and selenium, which are also less important but still necessary for appropriate brain function and development. We also see an important part of the diet of early hominids was with the introduction of tools. And we saw through fossil records that approximately 2 years ago, the Homo habatus species, an introduction of these tools. So this kind of leads to the next slide, which shows a graph here of the x-axis, which is age in millions of years, versus a y-axis of cranial capacity in centimeters cubed. As we move left on the x-axis, we're decreasing in years. So as we said, the tools have been introduced approximately 2 million years ago. We also see that approximately 2 million years ago, the cranial capacity in early Homo species began to increase all the way up until 0, which is modern humans. It gets a little jumbled, but you can see that large increase, which is about the cranial capacity is about 3 times larger than it was 2 million years ago. And before 2 million years ago, there was just kind of a steady, unchanged cranial capacity. So this introduction of tools, as well as a shore-based diet, which is also supported by the fact that around this same time, their early hominids were seen to have inhabited shore areas in eastern Africa. So this would allow for a smaller gut since we have access to higher energy foods with more amino acids and more of these minerals and nutrients. Some comparative anatomical studies that we're going to take a quick look at are with the Lake Tanganyika cichlids, with birds and guppies. So first, we'll look at pectoral muscles in birds. What was seen and is depicted in this graph is a negative correlation between pectoral muscle mass and brain mass. So this is through the energy trade-off hypothesis. But we see that as residuals in pectoral mass, which is on the x-axis increases, residuals in brain mass decrease. So we can see a trade-off right there. Getting a little more close to home with the extensive tissue hypothesis, we can look at the Lake Tanganyika cichlids. This was a very interesting study that showed adaptive radiation with these cichlids in this lake region of Africa. What was seen in this study, well, there's multiple different parameters on this chart, but we're just going to look at the ones with a significant p-value, which were gut length, egg size, and care duration. And so what they saw was that the cichlids that lived in regions of lake with more of a plant diet and more of a vegetative diet had larger gut lengths because of this. They needed a more extensive process to break it down. And they saw a negative correlation between gut length and brain size. So as these animals were needing a longer gut to get the nutrients they needed, their brain size was smaller. Supporting the energy trade-off hypothesis, it was seen that egg size decreased in relation to brain size. So there's a negative correlation there, and a positive correlation between care duration and brain size with a significant p-value of 0.007. Last, and probably the most interesting study was with guppies. So this was interesting because it was a little more controlled, and they took these guppies and bred them. And over generations, they saw a division with certain populations showing a larger brain size, and they would breed more often together, and a population of smaller brain size. Then once they saw this division, they were able to study the fish, and there's a similar trend between males and females, but especially in the male guppies, there was this significant negative correlation between brain size and gut size. So the small brain males had much larger gut sizes. And then on the right chart, we see the right graph, we see the small brain, large brain fish referring to females and the number of offspring they had. So more energy was allocated towards creating greater amounts of offspring, which correlates to a smaller brain, and vice versa. So in conclusion, the expensive tissue hypothesis and energy trade-off hypothesis practically work hand in hand. The expensive tissue hypothesis is much more narrow, and as we saw, there is a strong correlation between human brain size being larger and a smaller gut size. But the energy trade-off hypothesis is important because different taxa are going to experience different trade-offs. Now this makes sense because of the lineage of these different taxa. We saw the increase of brain size, which is correlated with the decreased gut size, approximately 2 million years ago in humans. And this was much more recent than the divergence of human from other taxa, such as birds and guppies. And so it makes sense that they would experience their own relative evolutionary changes and trade-offs. And to continue this, I think it would be beneficial to examine primates and see how generations are affected by by different diets, ones that are more energetically favorable with high nutrients, accessible nutrients and energy, versus one that's difficult, and see if over generations they can see a change in brain size through this. And that's it. Thank you.